Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 2nd, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, it's the final chapter in the Hot Side Aeration experiment from Brian Warren and John Holder. Andy Sparks and I joined Brian and John in Denver while we were in town for GABF to taste the samples one last time. We'll hear that session, and we'll hear comments about the experiment process from John Palmer, who we also ran into while we were in Denver. As usual, John proves that he knows way more about brewing than we do. But, as John usually does, he did it in a nice way. So it was good to run into John, and very helpful, the information that he passed on. Well, before we get into the show, I've got a couple of reminders. As I mentioned this past week, the American Homebrewers Association's annual Teach a Friend to Homebrew Day is this weekend, November 4th. I believe that Steve Wilkes, Andy Sparks, and I will be joining members of the local Fayetteville, Arkansas Homebrew Club at a group brew to mark the occasion. I hope to get a video episode out of that day, so be on the lookout for that. This week I posted a new episode of Basic Brewing Video, speaking of which, and so far I'm keeping to my goal of having a new video episode every other week. In this week's episode, Steve Wilkes uses 5 homebrews as ingredients in a traditional holiday feast, at least traditional for most Americans, I'd say. And I have to say that Steve really did outdo himself this time. He cooked up a storm while I mostly sat and sipped homebrew and watched him work. So thanks to Steve for all the work in this week's show. Speaking of the holidays, you may not believe this, but I've actually received messages from listeners and viewers who say they don't need brewing DVDs or basic brewing shirts or hats, but they still want to support financially the work we do here at Basic Brewing. Well, if you fit into that slim category of folks, you can look on basicbrewing.com. And you can see a little Amazon.com banner ad on the right side of the page. And if you're an Amazon.com user, and you click on that link and then do your holiday shopping on Amazon, we'll get about a 5% commission on your purchases. So you have to start each shopping session by clicking on that ad for it to count. So in other words, you can't shop around and then come back later on and do another session. You have to click on our ad to start the session for it to count toward us. So that's one way that you can help. And for your information, I don't get to see who buys what when people do that, but I can tell what items have been purchased. Often people buy the things you'd expect, brewing books and such as that. But there have been some other interesting items purchased as well. For instance, along with Beer Captured, we see Big Box of Boynton, Barnyard Dance, Pajama Time, and Oh My, Oh Dinosaurs. And along with the new Complete Joy of Home Brewing, we have Mary Englebright's Tiny Teeny Halloweeny Treasury. So there you go. We have a well-rounded Basic Brewing audience. And again, I have no way of knowing who ordered what. It's just fun to see what people are buying from Amazon. So if you're in the holiday spirit and you're buying lots of stuff for your friends and family, remember us here at Basic Brewing Radio. Now let's take a quick look into the mailbag. Eric from American Canyon writes, I just wanted to let you know I put my beer into a secondary fermenter. Well, congratulations, Eric. Eric says, what do you do with the stuff on the bottom of the primary? Well, Eric, a lot of that stuff is good old yeast, and you can use that to make more good beer. Now, the easiest thing to do to reuse that yeast is to plan another brew day on the day when you rack the beer off your primary. Then you can just put your new cooled wort, on top of that primary yeast, give it a good shake to aerate, put the lid and airlock on it, and wait. Well, you won't have to wait long, though, because you'll see active fermentation in a very short period of time. Now, I've done this on a handful of occasions, and it's fun to watch because it happens so quickly. Some brewers say that you can repeat the process a few times without harm. Now, I've only reused yeast for one round using this technique. In other words, I've only reused one batch of yeast in this method once at a time, if that makes sense. Now, this is especially useful if you want to brew a high-gravity beer. You can essentially brew a moderate gravity beer as a starter. In other words, make a moderate gravity beer around 1050 and then put the high gravity beer on top of the primary yeast from that 1050 beer, and it should give you a lot of good healthy yeast to go into fermenting that high gravity beer. Now, one thing, you may not want to use the yeast that has been through the fermentation of a high gravity beer. You may not want to reuse that yeast because of the stress that a high-gravity fermentation puts on yeast. Now, I've stretched my yeast even further by washing it with sterilized water. And if you look on the Y Yeast Lab site, they have some good instructions on how to wash the protein, the hop debris, and such from your healthy yeast, so you can store it in the fridge for a little while until you can use it again. And I've gotten 5 or 6 batches of beer from one batch of yeast using this technique. And I'll post the link to the Y yeast washing page in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. So, you can choose to pour your primary yeast down the drain, or you can stretch your yeast buying dollar a bit more by reusing what you've grown up in the bottom of your fermenter during primary fermentation. Bill from Wyndham, Vermont asks, I wanted to ask you and the podcast listeners if they've ever tried using barley malt syrup for extract beer making. It seems a lot less expensive than malt extract. Do you really get what you pay for? Bill says, I understand it is generally used for baking, but I do not see why it could or should not be used for making a garden variety ale. Well, Bill, it seems to me that I remember a conversation with Bob Hansen of Breese Malt and Ingredients on this subject, and I believe that Bob told me that the baker's malt extract is made using a lower grade malt, and I believe the process is different somehow from making brewer's malt extract. So you may get something that is technically a beer, but it may not be of the quality that you expect. However, if you want to do an experimental small batch of beer using baker's malt extract, I'd like to hear how it comes out. Also, if you're listening and you have experience with brewing with baker's extract, please write in and let us know. You can write to james@basicbrewing.com or just use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. Now on to our Hot Side Aeration experiment. If you're new to brewing and or the show, let me give you some background. Hot Side Aeration, or aerating your wort while it's still hot and before it's cooled for fermentation, is said to lead to premature staling of the beer. Now, there are many who believe hot side aeration, or HSA, is a myth, or at least it's overblown in the importance for the home brewer. Now, to test whether HSA is a myth or real concern, Brian Warren and John Holder conducted an experiment aerating the wort at 2 control points, after the mash and after the boil. You can hear more details on that here in a few minutes. Now, while we were in Denver at a press event, we got the chance to talk to John Palmer, author of How to Brew. John's an incredibly nice guy and knows a lot about brewing and the technical side of things. And John told Brian, Andy Sparks, and me about a control point that the experiment didn't address. And here's how that conversation went. Well, John Palmer, it's good to talk to you again.
Hi, glad to be here.
And this is an interesting recording because we're recording this after we did our hot side aeration experiment tasting earlier in the week, but I assume I'm going to play this before. So it's interesting timing. But we were talking about Brian and John's hot side aeration experiment, and you had some thoughts on the experiment and the way it was done.
Well, I've really been interested in hearing about this hot side aeration experiment. It's a subject that I've always been interested in. I'm, of course, one of the more pedantic, home brewers out there. I read a lot of papers, read articles, and so on. But I don't have the time to do these neat experiments like you all have done. One thing that struck me in the hot side aeration experiment was the aeration of the mash was being done at saccharification temperatures and kind of after the fact. And one thing I learned as I was working on the third edition of my book was about an enzyme called lipoxygenase. Lipoxygenase, it's not a beneficial enzyme, but what it does is it actually attracts and binds oxygen to, I believe, lipids and melanoidins in the mash, and it does it. This enzyme is active in the dough-in temperature range from 100 up to 120, 130 degrees. It's denatured when you get up to saccharification temperature. It's 60 C. I've gotten used to thinking about this in terms of degrees C. So when you are doughing in and you put your grain in the cooler and you pour in some hot water and you start stirring that up and making sure you don't have any dough balls, that's when lipoxygenase is active. It's binding oxygen to the lipids and the melanoidins that are in the mash at that point, and they're going to stay there, and then they're going to come out later in the beer. And because it's denatured, by the time you get up to, say, single infusion mash temperatures at 150 degrees C, you're not going to get that expression of hot side aeration, by adding air to the mash after those temperatures. And so I am curious. I mean, you've tasted only small differences in the beers as a result of your experiment. It'd be neat to do it again, or to brew up a similar batch of beer and whisk it up in those low temperature range, and then see if you notice a difference after the same period of time.
So what do you think, Brian?
Oh, I'm a failure. I'll never be a scientist. No, I mean, throughout this whole thing, we've really kind of learned a lot. Part about the experimentation process and part about just the whole world of hot side aeration. And John mentions that he doesn't have time to do these experiments, and neither do I. But found this one little time when we could, and so I really want to do it again. I want to do it several times to kind of see what happens, and maybe someday I'll have the time to do it.
and to do it in the mash would be potentially more time consuming, because you would have to do two mashes.
Yeah.
And it's not dividing the batch after the mash, so you would have to do a setup with a smaller, maybe more on the scale of like a partial mash or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking back to your interview with Charlie Papazian the other day, where he was talking about the way that he mashes and the way that he brews, and where he's ladling a hot mash, from the mash tun to the lauter tun, and he goes, "I brew great beer," and I believe him. I mean, certainly a man like that has the experience to know he's making great beer. And then you have so many homebrewers that say, "Oh, I think hot side aeration is a myth." Well, why? And is it because what we have thought we understood about hot side aeration and when it occurs has become distorted? Maybe what the hot side aeration we should be talking about is aeration at those early mash temperatures, multiple infusion mash temperatures, decoction mash temperatures, where we're going through the dough in and the protein rest and so on. Maybe that's where we need to be concerned about it, rather than the single temp infusions when we're above the denaturing step. And it would be great to be able to answer that definitively.
So maybe one day.
Yeah, maybe one day. Maybe you and I can email about it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Set up an experiment. All of these experiments we do, they just bring up more question marks than answers. Every single time I do something like this, it's like, well, is an interesting conversation piece, but I'm not sure I'm going to learn a whole lot from it.
I'm wondering that if for a control, and I don't know, you might be able to answer this, for me, it would be easy to flood my mash tun with CO2 before I started working, and then I would know I don't have any oxygen there, and then do one where we actually aerated it a little bit, and then that would kind of really push the samples apart. and then you know there absolutely was no oxygen in your mash in.
Do it extract oxygen from the water itself? I mean,
Oh yeah, it'll lipoxygenase will grab any source of O2 that's available, and there's a paper by Bamforth and 2 or 3 other authors too. They collaborated on about oxidation and oxygen radicals, and oxygen radicals can be created simply from material that's there. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the atmosphere. So, I mean, they're talking about peroxide being created, from different, components in the mash. So, having the mash tun, flooded with CO2, to blanket it may not be enough. It could be, there could be oxygen coming in before that. In thinking about the Australian craft brewing scene, I remember Graham Sanders saying that they add Camden tablets, sodium metabisulfite, to their mashes, which really helps, take up and debind that oxygen and take it out of the mash. And they say that they've really avoided the whole hot side aeration phenomena by putting a small, 1 Camden tablet worth of sodium metabisulfite into the mash to bind up that oxygen. So I think there's probably several ways that we could investigate, taking oxygen out of the equation and seeing if we can notice, a real improvement in the stability of our beers.
Well, what do you think about Charlie's natural remedy, the cinnamon? Yeah.
That could be. I being a metallurgist, I don't know anything about organic chemistry. Everything I've learned about organic chemistry has been from brewing. I don't know what properties to attribute to cinnamon or coriander to say that they are effective antioxidants.
One thing that we saw at New Belgium is they actually have what they call a DAW system, de-air water. They called it de-aired water, which I think they really mean deoxygenated water. But they seem to use it for things like purging out equipment, flushing the filters before they use them, so that there is no oxygen in the lines and stuff, even in the water and stuff. But I'm also wondering if that's another, because oxygen, water's full of oxygen, so.
Basically that would be pre-boiled water to get all the dissolved gases out. It's funny, deionized water, distilled water. As soon as you expose that to the air, carbon dioxide starts seeping into it. The law of gas partial pressure says that is an area of low concentration, and gas just starts diffusing in as soon as you expose it to the air. So distilled water doesn't stay distilled very long. It starts filling up with CO2 and generating bicarbonates. But I can see why they would want to use a de-aired or a deionized water for rinsing and flushing.
Well, we certainly appreciate your knowledge and your input, and we will keep that in the back of our heads as we go forward.
That'd be great. I'm just here to help.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
So thanks again to John for shedding some additional light on the subject. So hot side aeration might still be a concern for all grain brewers at the dough-in stage, and we'll have to await a future experiment for more data on that. In the meantime, let's go back in time a few days before that conversation to the day that we did our tasting of the hot side aeration experiment samples. Well, Brian Warren and John Holder and Andy Sparks, welcome, guys, again to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And this is, we hope, the last installment of the episodes on your hot side aeration experiment. We started off tasting the beers down in Austin, and then we moved on to you guys tasting, John and Brian, tasting the beers over the phone. And now we are here again, and maybe we should start. And Andy is new to the experience; he's tasted none of these beers at any point. And who wants to just tell us the basis of bring us up to date with a Reader's Digest version of the experiment with how this all started and how the experiment was initially conducted.
Like a lot of great ideas, it started out on chat while I was at work with Brian. We'd kind of gotten into this thing, if you recall the show way back with Casey in Arkansas. Brian had been joking about hot side aeration, and he mentioned the myth of it, and then we did some more research, concluded it was a myth, to sum up a lot in a little time, and chose to make an experiment to try and demonstrate that, which we dreamed up over the chat. In this experiment, and through our reading, we determined that hot side aeration is when you inject lots of oxygen into your beer at two bad times, either after the mash or during the mash and right after the boil are the two times it should affect it. So we brewed 2 micro batches of beer. One, we mashed it all together and we split it halfway, aerated half, didn't aerate the other half, boiled, split them half and half again, and beat them up again with a little whisk thing into little wort cappuccinos, as Brian affectionately calls them. And here we are with our experiment. So
we essentially have one beer with no aeration. We have one beer that has been aerated after the mash, before the boil. Another beer that has been aerated not after the mash, but after the boil. And another beer that has been aerated after the mash and after the boil, the kind of double whammy. And talk again about the method that you used, Brian, to aerate the wort, and something that would never happen in normal home brewing conditions.
Well, sure. I mean, normal home brewing conditions where you might aerate might be if you're kind of scooping the mash or maybe just ladling it in some way that might let it splash around a bit. And so we thought, well, that's all well and good, but let's go extreme and see what would really happen as far as the flavor of the beer. So John has this little weird contorted whisk. And basically I just kind of, if you imagine a Boy Scout trying to start a fire with a stick, I was just rubbing it between my hands and it was swirling around. And we took a couple pictures, but basically it just, it foamed up real big. Just kind of like the head on a really highly carbonated beer, or as like John said, a beer cappuccino.
And do you remember cast your mind back, if you would, Brian, back to the Austin Homebrew Supply Store, where we were sitting and we first tasted these beers. And John, you weren't there, unfortunately.
They were in the bottle about 2 weeks at that point.
And there was a difference. We tasted, the beer without aeration was normal tasting, a bit underhopped, but that was on purpose. Mm-hmm. And then the beers that were aerated had a bit of a fruity flavor. Right.
The two that I remember of the flavors were kind of a fruity, kind of somewhat estery flavor, and then also just kind of somewhat of a fusel, kind of oily texture to them. And that was none of the. If you read in the textbooks, you'll read, that hot side aeration in an extra oxidation while it's hot can produce cardboardy flavors, and we never got any of that.
And then, and one of the batches was infected, we determined.
Right.
And then there was another tasting, and I wasn't there, so I didn't get the benefit of the tasting. But John, bring us up to date on what happened at that one.
That one, we continued to properly cellar the beers, knowing that over time hot side aeration is supposed to show up with time. And so we sat down and poured the beers, and to our surprise, it seemed that they were a little better as a whole. But we also had noticed that it seemed like, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2 of them that there was a slight kind of mouth coating character that we couldn't really get rid of, almost oily like. And if I recall, that could happen as a character of hot side aeration during the mash as the fatty lipids break down. But we're still not sure if we beat it up enough to know if what we're discerning as differences or just differences in our experimental process. Yeah.
So what we're proving here is that if you're a wacky man and you or a wacky woman, a wacky brewer, and you just beat the crap out of your beer, that it can have an effect on the brew. I mean, that's essentially what we've proved, right?
That seems to be the case, although the effects between these different beers hasn't really been all that big, with the exception of the infected batch, which has nothing to do with hot side aeration. And, of course, our hypothesis was that with just kind of average care while making a beer, we wouldn't see any problems for a home brewer in hot side aeration.
But you can't leave well enough alone.
No, not with home brewing.
You can't, we couldn't stop there. You had to go further. And Andy called this process, what you did today, alcohol abuse.
Nobody should be doing that.
So John, tell us what you did today.
Well, we know that poor storage, bad temperatures, sunlight, and things like that also contribute to the acceleration of aging for a beer to make hot side aeration occur as an effect in your beer. So at work today, I parked on the roof of the parking garage facing south and stuck these beers on my dashboard in full sunlight for all morning till around 1 o'clock. And I went out to check on them because I was a little worried. Have I put beer grenades in my car? I'm wondering about the wisdom of all of this. And I opened my car door, and there's a aroma. But things look kosher, and I touch the bottles, and they're quite hot to the touch. I'm guessing 120 to 130 Fahrenheit on the bottles.
Wow. And this is not a hot day in Denver.
No, today's high is 70, but I know that UV rays in
the
a car,
greenhouse effect.
Yeah, well, this is why you don't lock your children in the car while you're in the store, or your pet, or your beer. Yes, put a cooler in your trunk if you need to leave your beer. So I pick up the first beer, and out from under the cap oozes some of the beer onto the dashboard and runs down the dashboard. And I'm thinking, is this going to explode before I get it safely into the refrigerator at work? And there was a great mercy that none of it really did explode, and I was able to wipe up the small mess on the dashboard. It wasn't very big. And the beer, up until about 40 minutes ago, still felt kind of warm to the touch. It had just started to feel cool when I came over, and then we threw them in the freezer for about 15 minutes to get them to a place where a human would be willing to put it in their mouth.
And thus here we are. Aren't you excited, Andy?
Well, I'm excited about the first glass. Second glass, not so much. And that one at the end, well, let's just say we'll wait and see.
That would be the infected one.
Yeah. The one on the end. If you're familiar with the little snakes that you buy on the 4th of July that you light, and they kind of grow well, this is kind of a white foamy version of that coming out of the top of the bottle there. This growing snake of foam that was easing out of the top of the bottle there.
The plus is it's highly entertaining.
And I don't know, before we taste, maybe we should say what happened. And I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure the Charlie Papazian interview will air before this one. I was going to air this one before the Papazian interview, but after talking to Charlie this morning at his house by the stream, and talking about home brewing, I can't wait to share that one. So. Sorry, you guys.
Hey, no worries.
But I asked Charlie, I said, are there any myths about home brewing that you think are being perpetuated that you think are need to be dispelled? And he said...
Well, he said hot side aeration, and I was just so excited when he said that.
You kind of jumped up in the chair.
I know, I was waving my arms. And basically, what he said was at the homebrew scale... It's not something to be worried about. Most homebrewers properly store their beer. It goes from the kettle to the fermenter, and from the fermenter to your cellar, and any of the bad stuff that would happen from hot side aeration is stuff that great big brewers need to worry about when they distribute their beer and let it sit in convenience store windows for weeks on end. And that's when he said that's where big brewers need to worry about hot side aeration, and the home brewer doesn't need to. And so I felt, of course, gratified that my homebrew hero would say that. And so, and it was only appropriate that this afternoon we would have our little tasting.
And Andy, do you remember there was a little safety precaution that Charlie took little ingredient that Charlie took with these as ingredients to kind of stave off the effects that any hot side aeration would cause.
Yeah, he had a couple things. Basically, he adds a couple things. But basically, it's to help counteract oxidation, and it's because they're excellent antioxidants. And the things he suggested was one, coriander. That has a slightly spicy taste, kind of a lemony taste, which may impart itself in the beer. But what he suggests using is a little bit of cinnamon. He says he uses about a teaspoon, I think it was,
or maybe even half a teaspoon. We'll have to go listen to the episode and see.
And we asked him about any perceivable cinnamon character in the finished beer. He says he's never perceived any cinnamon character, but that it does tend to make the beers seem to last and stay fresher longer.
He was specifically talking about was it a wit beer that had the coriander in it, and it was cellared for years, and it never seemed to go stale. And he was talking to a professor friend of his, and he said, well, the coriander has antioxidant characteristics. So if you are concerned about, and I got an email from Graham Sanders from Craft Brewer Radio talking about an ingredient that they use down there to stave off the effects of hot side aeration. And I can't remember that. You'll have to search the archives for that one.
Is that a commercial product for brewers that they're using, or is it something?
It's of course I'm on the spot now. It's like a mineral or something like this. It's a certain chemical that they
some sort of antioxidant similar to the cinnamon.
Yeah. One of the things Charlie did say is that there is a couple products on the market that professionals use that are basically like ground bark and stuff that they use. It's just powerful antioxidants that they use to add to their beer and help keep it very fresh.
But I guess our theory is that on the homebrewing scale, you probably don't have to worry about it at all. And if you do worry about it, like half a teaspoon of cinnamon in the beer may make you sleep better at night. I don't know, in the mash, it may make you sleep better at night. So anyway, I thought that was very interesting that he pulled that out as the number one myth that he said is really not a myth, because on the commercial scale it is something that you have to look out for, but on the homebrewing scale, not so much. So, saying that, shall we move on to the tasting? There's this one that's labeled NN, which I assume means no aeration after the mash, no aeration after the boil.
Correct.
And so we've got one little snifter here. So shall we just pass it around and
Sure.
take a taste? And I may have to edit out the little pause here, but we'll reserve comments until it's made the rounds. There's something ceremonial about this whole process, right?
We are blood brothers.
We're sharing saliva here in the... and my cold sore is almost healed up, so don't worry about it.
I hear alcohol has antiseptic properties.
So what do we think, Andy?
Well, it's a very mild beer. It doesn't have a lot of overwhelming hop character, which you said was on purpose so that you could, maybe help to taste the differences between them. Nothing really off flavor. No, nothing that strikes me as a bad thing. So, pretty good.
John?
I definitely enjoyed this one. It's for a mild, fairly low hop pale ale. It's okay.
Same here. Yeah, it's pretty boring, but in a good way.
Yeah, I was on the first taste. I was trying to infer that there was some skunking in there, but on the second taste, I sneaked a little second taste. I don't really taste any flaws in it. It's a little warm for my taste, but it's been on the dash all day.
Well, and being warm helps identify flaws. So for this experiment, it's appropriate potentially to have this beer warmer than we should be having it. So.
Yeah, I agree. It magnifies the flavors. It doesn't dull the flavors at all. And it's a little late to do a blind tasting of all these, but let's move on to the next one. And this is labeled AA. meaning this is the one that got the
abuse.
The alcohol abuse.
It's really AAA today.
So AAA. So this is the one that they got the triple, the double whammy. You got the aeration after the mash and after the boil. So we'll do a little taste of that. Thoughtful looks all around. And Brian's the last of the line. Maybe we ought to switch orders here.
On the last one, go that way.
Brian seems to enjoy it. So, Brian, we'll start with you first.
Well, I thought the aroma was a lot different. It smelled kind of almost sour. I'm not getting as much of the kind of oily texture that I got before, but it does taste just a little bit off.
I don't know if I'd have said sour, but there's a definite fruit note in the aroma. On the front of my tongue, it tasted a lot like the other beer, but as it faded in the back, it just got kind of gross, nasty, a little. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a flavor I really enjoy on the back of my palate.
Yeah, I really didn't discern quite as much difference in the aroma. It is maybe slightly more sour aroma. There is a kind of a slight, it's that kind of. It's the smell of wet cardboard. It's not the taste. But it's a dull, flat taste in there that's in the very back.
That's what it is, a flat taste in the back. I agree with you. That is a very good description of it.
I didn't discern a huge amount of difference between the non-abused and the fully abused. I would expect that after this beer has been abused so much that there would be a huge, tremendous difference between the two. And I don't know that in a blind tasting I would be able to discern that much of a difference. I mean, we are crippling ourselves in a way in that this is not a blind tasting. And I'm sure that there are going to be some out there that are going to criticize that. But I don't. It's not unpleasant. I mean, I certainly don't. I'm not wanting to spit it out at all.
No.
Yeah, I mean, if I had this homebrew come across in a contest or something, I mean, it wouldn't have rated super high, but I wouldn't have wrote things like this tastes infected or this tastes like you've got a serious problem. I would have had trouble telling you that you abused it, or I wouldn't have known that what you did to it clearly by the taste.
I think it's important to note that my comments on the flat taste and the fruity, it's very slight on both cases. I mean, I can detect it, but, I'd drink the beer. It's better than some American light lagers, I think.
Slow down. It's not cold enough, maybe, for you.
It needs to be Beechwood aged.
Now.
All right.
You're not tasting the cold. And Brian, you and I are the only ones who, at this table, who were in Austin and tasting the original brews. It seems to me that the difference between the non-abused and the fully abused is certainly less than it was in that initial tasting. I mean, that initial tasting, the fully abused beer was much more fruity than the non-abused beer.
Yeah, I'd say it's really mellowed out quite a bit on all levels. And the kind of the flat taste is probably a little new, maybe a result of the abuse, the secondary abuse that John did today. But honestly, I mean, slight differences, and it has mellowed out quite a bit. Ironically, since supposedly HSA presents itself over time.
Just in case someone listening thinks that the non-abused beer wasn't in the sunlight on the car, it was. It suffered the same sunlight temperature effects as these other beers. So please keep that in mind.
So now we move on to the beer labeled NA, which is not abused after the mash, but abused after the boil while it was still hot. So now, Brian, you want to go first this time, since you were the last in the line the last times? And again, there's kind of a ceremonious, is that a word? I don't know.
I got to go get my peace pipe. I'll be right back.
John's pouring more for me now.
Just keep it topped up.
Wow. That one's a good bit different, I think.
Ooh. Okay. Brian, you go first now that you...
Andy was saying.
Okay, Andy.
You know, it almost seems to have less flavor. I'm not sure how to describe it. It's a much less impressive beer. If these are all basically the same recipes, it's surprising because it doesn't have the flavor that the other ones did. It doesn't taste necessarily bad, but it definitely tastes different. And to me, just kind of a softer, less flavorful finish.
I think it's a little softer. I think it has a little more body, and I think that we probably didn't get quite as much hops into this beer. The little tiny amounts we were adding. I think there.
Now's not the time to question the process, John.
But the beer's not bad. I mean, it's okay.
I'd say it's more like the first one than the second one.
I think so.
Huh.
I think so.
You know, I got the impression at the end of this one that it was kind of like at the end of it, it was kind of like just like flat. It just...
Is it more
the
oxidation stuff?
You know, I don't know. It just at the end of it, it wasn't bright. It was dull at the end, just as I was... It tasted okay going in. It smelled okay, but at the end of the... Just as I was swallowing, it was kind of like, bleh, just kind of a flat. I don't know. I don't know these things.
I can say I didn't detect that this time. So.
Am I alone? There are various hand signals going on. Maybe I'll taste the first and then. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe it's the effects of Brian's saliva. I don't know. Okay, now we go to the fourth, which is abused after the boil and not abused
After the mash.
No,
Other way around.
You're right. I'm sorry. Abused after the mash, not abused after the boil. Thank you, John. Who wants to go? John, you want to go first this time?
Well, thank you. I think this is the infected one. So it's my pleasure to take one for the troops.
If you start retching,
Well, I don't really smell the infection.
Maybe it's not.
I think that's the one that we suspected from earlier.
Well, it certainly did some odd things in the bottle after you opened it.
Yeah.
Nothing like a little glowworm action.
It certainly doesn't taste infected. When we were talking earlier, I was afraid I was going to get a shock, but no, it's in the same league as both the other ones that have been abused. I think I really like the NN one best, the no abuse completely. But the honest truth, I think this proves the point that none of them are that different. And if this was a blind taste, we'd be struggling to pick out which one was the worst and which one was the best.
I agree.
These beers were sitting out during the whole intro, and so a lot of the aroma was lost. And so I did a little swirling around while you guys were talking, and it did smell a little more estery. It did smell a little more kind of floral and yeasty. So, I mean, on aroma, I might have detected something was going on there, but it really didn't taste funky like before. I mean,
it's entirely possible that the other two were due to bottle cleanliness.
Sure.
I mean, it would have been my first two infected bottles and gallons of beer in 12 years. But
And it's odd that it would happen on the same batch.
yeah.
right.
The thing I detected on that very last one is there was a feeling like something was coating my mouth. As after I swallowed, I noticed my mouth felt coated that I didn't detect with the other ones. But it wasn't necessarily bad flavor. It just wasn't a great feeling. So.
And you were the first to taste, so it wasn't like Andy was eating a piece of cheese and
No. But I think Andy was right. These are all a lot more similar than I even remember them being back when we tasted it. Was it August? No, it was July.
It was maybe July or August. I mean, it's also possible that our yeast won.
Yeah.
maybe, Charlie actually talked a little bit about that, and about how kind of the stronger of the yeasts may win over time. And maybe, I don't know, I mean, it's all ad hoc theory at this point, but yeah, the point is proven that over time, even after much abusing, it's really not that big of a deal.
I'm pleased that we've proved the hypothesis. I mean, I think our experimental conditions could have been, lab coat scientific, and we'd have proven it a little better than this. But I think we were rigorous enough to have shown the point. None of these are really that different.
Yeah, I mean, we could have used beer protection shirts.
Well, I would like to suggest that if anybody thinks that we should have done a blind test, then they should send us 4 beers and we'll test them, and then you tell us which ones were abused and which ones weren't.
Now that procedure,
and that would be the way.
And if you'd like the recipe, we do have it up on a website. We can arrange for you to.
We can put it on the list.
See our entire procedure and follow it and send in an ABCD. And I'm sure James would love to have other testers come in and see what they think.
Yeah, I think that. That would be the ultimate way to take out the perceptions, the clouding of perceptions by the knowledge of which batch is which. But I can't discern a huge amount of difference between any of these. I mean, it seems to me that if hot side aeration was such a danger to beer, and you beat the crap out of the beer and really, really aerated it, and I've seen photographs, it seems to me that if hot side aeration was so much a danger, that there would be radical differences between these beers, and even between the one that was not abused at all and the one that was abused very well. There was not that huge amount. Now, let me bring this up. What if someone says, well, okay, you had all 4 beers on the dashboard of your car, therefore they were evenly damaged in the car, and that erased all the effects, all that damage erased the effects of hot side aeration on the beers, and so they're equally damaged, and so of course they taste alike.
One could posit that, but in a beer that hasn't had any hot side aeration, it's like the big brewery is trying to do. They're trying to protect their beer from oxidation. They're taking great care, that it could sit in the shelf in a store in the sun for weeks on end and still be something someone would want to drink. And I think that the commercial example helps prove the point. Again, we didn't keep these in the sun for weeks and weeks and weeks. Maybe we should have abused them even further, but I don't think I will. I have a couple bottles left, and I'm not going to do another taste. So.
I mean, in the readings that we've done on the subject, it says that storage abuse, poor storage accelerates the effects of hot side aeration and makes them worse. And that's why you shouldn't do it, is because the beer may be stored, and it would hot side aerated beer would taste worse than otherwise. And so, I don't know. I mean, it seems like the idea that poor storage would erase the effects. It seems like big brewers would not worry about it then, because most of their beer is stored poorly. I don't know. I went into this experiment into this tasting expecting radical different flavors, and so the whole idea of it not being blind, I don't know. I mean, I expected really bad flavors, and I didn't get them, and so it's kind of like going against all of my presuppositions.
Now, one other thing to point out: these are all in brown glass bottles. One could posit hops will skunk and all these other things. We certainly didn't notice. Again, they were only out one day, but from what I understand about the hop skunking problem, it could occur very quickly with the sun, with the breaking down of the various compounds. I
had a lightly hopped Hefeweizen out on the patio while we were shooting an episode of Basic Brewing Video, and even with the lightly hopped Hefeweizen sitting on the patio for 15 minutes in the sun, the skunking was pronounced. Thank you. Yeah, it was it was very clear that it was skunked. And we were sitting out with Charlie in the sun by the creek, and he was saying that his hoppy beer was tasting skunked after being out there for just a small amount of time. So
that proves the point.
So I guess the long and short of it is that in our recommendations in coming out of this experiment is if you were concerned because you splash a little bit when you pour your beer from one container to the other while it's hot, don't worry about it. Let's say it all together. Relax, don't worry, have a home brew. Now it is ceremonial.
Charlie's grooving on our peace pipe now.
What do you think, Andy? What's your conclusion?
Well, I think that what we should have found at least some difference between the non-abused beer and the other ones. There was hardly any difference. You would have thought that between the non-abused beer and the double abused beer, that would be the most dramatic difference, and that we should be able to taste those side by side. And I can assure you, we've been sitting here doing that. Each of us have been picking them up and tasting them side by side, trying to discern a real dramatic difference. And there's just not one there. And the other point was about the abusing all the beers is that we did have a control. The double N batch was abused along with them. So I would expect if the abuse was to hurt the beers, we should have found this double N, the unabused beer, to be objectionable. It should have had flaws that were brought on by the abuse, and I really didn't discern any. It would have been nice for a little colder maybe, and we probably would have been all pretty happy with it.
So, I'll probably chill the last couple bottles down and just drink them.
Serve them to unsuspecting guests.
I have a few friends that would probably like this, and I'll give them that instead of the good stuff.
So beware, friends of John.
The ones who would drink it probably wouldn't listen to the podcast.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, guys,
to all John's friends, if he serves you a beer with A-N on the lid, worry. No, actually, it wasn't. It didn't have a problem either. So
I'll probably pour the ANs just in case one of the other bottles is bad.
Well, guys, it's been fun and educational as well. So I appreciate your help in all the work and putting this together, and I hope that people will gain a bit of comfort from the experience.
Thanks, James. I really appreciate the time you've taken to go through the process with us in this experiment.
It was our pleasure.
It's always fun to learn more about brewing beer with you, James.
Oh, shucks. Thanks, guys. So there you go. Thanks again to John Holder and Brian Warren for letting Andy and me play along for this final round. And thanks to Andy Sparks for taking part as well. And I hope the next time we get together we can share some beers that we're all proud to pass around. And by the way, Andy Sparks is my local homebrew store owner, and I always like to give him a little plug. You can find his site at thehomebrewery.com. That's thehomebrewery.com. Next week, Adam Avery from Avery Brewing in Boulder, Colorado joins us. Andy, Brian, and I spent a terrific afternoon at the Avery Tasting Room and managed to corner Adam for an interview in the process. Adam talks about home brewing and about living the homebrewer's dream of running a brewery. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can find our new hats and our shirts and stuff like that. And you can find our great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling, the whole way through. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And we also show you infusion mashing, step mashing, and we also show you fly sparging and batch sparging too. I don't know where that came from. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. It's just a little reward for those who, or maybe it's a deterrent for staying with the whole show to the very bitter end. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us online, and I'll send it to you my own darn self. Well, that's all. Until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson, who also designed our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.